The last Comanche woman faced a terrible fate. Until a silent rancher saved her freedom, the sun rose over the rolling plains, painting the horizon with streaks of gold and orange. The wind whispered softly through the tall grasses, carrying the scents of earth and wildflowers. In the quiet of this vast land, far from the nearest town, lived Ahioka, the last Comanche woman in the region. Her small cabin sat at the edge of a grove of cottonwood trees, built by her ancestors long before settlers began claiming the plains. Each log was carefully placed, each stone around the hearth worn smooth by generations of hands that had made a home here. To Ahioka, this land was more than just a place to live. It was a living memory of her people, her family, and the traditions that had shaped her life. Ahioka woke each morning before the sun fully rose, carrying out her routine with quiet precision. She fed the chickens, drew water from the well, and tended to her small garden, where corn, beans, and squash grew in neat rows. Breaths. She moved with a grace and ease that came from years of living closely with the land. To outsiders, it might have seemed simple, even lonely, but for Ahioka, this rhythm of life was a connection to the spirits of her ancestors. Every action held meaning, and every corner of her cabin echoed stories of the past. Despite her solitude, Ahioka was not entirely alone. She shared the land with animals, her dog, a loyal companion named Kaya, and a few horses that she had trained herself. Kaya would sit by the cabin door as Ahioka worked, ears perked, alert to every sound of the plains. The horses, strong and patient, grazed nearby, their hooves soft against the soil. Together they formed a small, careful community, a world in which Ahioka could continue the life her people had known long ago. Breaths. Yet the peace of her life was fragile. Beyond the grove of cottonwoods, the world was changing rapidly. Settlers were arriving in increasing numbers, bringing with them fences, laws, and towns that did not always welcome people like Ahioka. The land that had been open to her ancestors now carried rules she could not always understand or follow. She had heard whispers in town, rumors of new sheriffs and landowners who were impatient with those who lived outside their control. Sometimes she would see a stranger's horse in the distance, or the shadow of a rider crossing the horizon, and her heart would tighten with unease. Ahioka remembered the stories her grandmother had told her when she was a child. Tales of buffalo herds that stretched as far as the eye could see, of brave warriors who defended their families, and of women who could heal wounds and read the winds. Her grandmother had taught her to speak Comanche, to honor the ceremonies of the people, and to listen to the language of the land. "The earth speaks," her grandmother would say. "If you listen carefully, it will tell you how to live." Ahioka had never forgotten this advice. Each morning she would close her eyes and feel the wind, sensing its shifts, hearing the distant call of birds, and understanding in a way what the land was trying to tell her. Despite her knowledge and her skills, life was not always easy. Winters were harsh on the plains, and storms could come suddenly, turning small streams into rushing rivers. Ahioka learned to rely on her instincts, to prepare for sudden changes, and to respect the power of nature. She had built her cabin strong against the wind, stored enough food to last through the cold months, and kept her animals close. Still, there were moments when she felt the weight of being alone, the awareness that she was the last of her people in this part of the world. It was a quiet sorrow, not loud or angry, but deep and persistent, like the low hum of the earth beneath her feet. In the nearby town, people often whispered about her. Some were curious. Some were suspicious. Children would sometimes peek through the trees when they passed by, fascinated by her solitary figure and the way she moved as if part of the land itself. Adults would talk quietly in stores or at the saloon, wondering about the Comanche woman who still lived on the outskirts. Few understood her life, and fewer still respected it. To many, she was a reminder of a past they wanted to forget. But Ahioka did not let their opinions shake her. She knew who she was, and she held her head high even when the world around her seemed to be moving on without her. Her days were filled with small acts of survival and tradition. She would gather herbs and roots, learning which could heal a cut, which could soothe a fever, and which could be used to dye her simple clothing. She would weave baskets and blankets, sometimes leaving them near the edge of her property for neighbors who respected her, a silent gesture of kindness that often went unnoticed. And each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she would sit outside her cabin, Kaya by her side, and watch the sky change colors. Stars would begin to twinkle, and she would tell the stories of her ancestors, speaking to the spirits of the plains in a language few others understood. One quiet evening, as Ahioka watched the sun sink behind the distant hills, she felt a change in the wind. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a signal that something was coming. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her hands, and listened. The plains were vast and open, but she had learned to hear even the smallest disturbances. Kaya growled softly, sensing what Ahioka already knew. The world around them was shifting, and danger might be near. Ahioka's heart did not race with fear. By droughts, storms, illness, and the suspicion of strangers, but she had always survived. Her strength came from knowledge, from patience, and from the quiet courage that had been passed down through generations. She knew that she could face whatever was coming, though she also understood that she could not do it alone forever. The world beyond her grove was changing too fast, and soon she might need help from someone who could see the value in her life and her heritage. Brand. As the night settled, Ahioka lit a small fire in the hearth of her cabin, its warm glow reflected in her eyes, steady and bright. She thought of her grandmother, of the people who had lived on these lands for centuries, and of the traditions that she had promised to keep alive. She whispered a prayer to the wind, asking for guidance, strength, and protection. Kaya lay at her feet, calm and alert, a silent reminder that even in solitude, she was not completely alone.
The moon rose high over the plains, casting silver light across the grasses and trees.
Ahioka sat outside for a long time, listening to the night sounds. The rustle of animals, the distant cry of an owl, the soft sigh of the wind.
In that quiet, she felt a deep connection to the world around her.
This land had seen joy and sorrow, peace and conflict, survival and loss. And here she was, the last of her people in this place, determined to honor that history, no matter what the future held. Grasping for Ahioka. Life was a balance of memory and survival, solitude and connection, strength and vulnerability. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to honor her heritage. She knew that her story was not just her own. It was part of a larger story, of a people who had lived on these plains for centuries. And even though she was the last, she carried that story forward with courage, grace, and determination. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ahioka closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the land beneath her, the wind around her, and the spirits of her ancestors close by. She was alone, yes, but she was not defeated. The plains had shaped her, and she had shaped them in return. And though the world outside might bring threats and challenges she could not yet see, she was ready to face whatever came next, with the quiet strength of generations guiding her every step. The days grew warmer as spring approached, and the plains began to awaken with life. Wildflowers painted the fields in soft yellows and purples, and the rivers, swollen from melted snow, sang as they flowed over rocks. Ahioka moved through her small world as usual, tending to her garden and caring for her animals. But there was an unease she could not shake. The wind seemed sharper, carrying whispers from the town beyond the hills, whispers that hinted at change and not all of it kind. Beyond, she had always known that living alone on the edge of the frontier carried risks. Settlers were moving farther into the plains, claiming land that had belonged to her people for generations. Some brought kindness, trade, and friendship, but others brought suspicion and greed. Ahioka had learned to keep her distance, to observe quietly, and to avoid confrontation. But she did not seek trouble, but trouble seemed to find her nonetheless.
One morning, as Ahioka worked in her garden, a rider appeared on the distant trail.
The figure was mounted on a dark horse, moving quickly toward her cabin. Ahioka paused, wiping her hands on her apron, and studied the approaching rider. The horseman's face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the purpose in his stride. The wind carried the faint sound of hooves pounding the soft earth, and Kaya growled low in her throat, her hackles raised. The rider stopped at the edge of her property, dismounting roughly. Ah. Ahioka felt a chill, though the sun was warm on her back. She stepped forward slowly, keeping her hands visible, and called to the man in a calm voice. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes were hard and his expression showed little patience. He introduced himself as a representative of the local landowner, a man who had recently claimed large portions of territory nearby.
The landowner had accused Ahioka of trespassing on his property and demanded she leave immediately.
There was a cold edge to the man's tone, as if her presence alone was an offense. Ahioka's heart sank, but she had never crossed the landowner's property intentionally. Her cabin, her garden, and her small herd of animals had always stayed within the boundaries her family had lived on for generations. Yet now she faced accusations she could not ignore. She knew the rules were changing, and she was not prepared to fight a legal battle she had no experience with. The man spoke of consequences, fines, imprisonment, and the possibility of being forced onto a reservation. He left her with a warning, his horse kicking up dust as he rode back toward town. Ahioka stood in the garden, her hands trembling slightly. She had faced storms, cold winters, and illness, but this threat felt different. But the law and the people who enforced it, without understanding her life or her history. Over the next few days, Ahioka observed the town from a distance, careful not to draw attention. Desk. She noticed the landowner speaking to the sheriff and to other townspeople, painting her as a troublemaker. The whispers she had felt on the wind were now louder. Carried in conversations at the store, the blacksmith, and even the schoolhouse. Brace. Some people were curious, others suspicious, and a few openly hostile. It became clear to Ahioka that she could not face this challenge alone. Despite the fear growing in her chest, Ahioka did not give in to despair. She relied on the lessons her grandmother had taught her. Wisdom, patience, and observation were as important as strength. Grasp. She began to prepare, quietly reinforcing her cabin, storing extra food, and making notes of her land's boundaries. She also sought allies, though few in town were willing to risk helping her openly. A kind merchant gave her extra supplies when she passed by, leaving them on her doorstep so no one would notice. A teacher from the town offered advice on legal matters, speaking carefully and quietly. Each act of support, though small, reminded Ahioka that she was not entirely alone. One afternoon, as she walked along the edge of her property checking the fences, Ahioka noticed a figure on a nearby hill watching her. He was a silent man, dressed in simple ranch clothes, leaning lightly on a fence post. Ahioka had seen him before. Samuel Whitaker, a quiet rancher who lived several miles away. He rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to his own lands and routines. Yet there was something in the way he observed her, not with suspicion, but with curiosity and respect. Ahioka felt a spark of hope. Perhaps he could help, she thought, though she did not know how much. But she did not call out to him, instead choosing to continue her work while keeping him in sight. Over the next few days, she noticed him again, sometimes leaving small bundles near the edge of her property, food, tools, or messages of advice left where she could find them without being seen.
His help was quiet, almost invisible, but it was steady.
The town's hostility was not limited to rumors. One morning she discovered that her garden had been trampled. her chickens scattered. Whoever had done it had been careful not to leave direct evidence, but the message was clear. She was unwelcome, and some people were willing to intimidate her to make her leave. Ahioka felt anger rising, but she tempered it with caution. Reacting in haste could bring more trouble. Instead, she focused on repair, mending fences, gathering her animals, and keeping her garden safe. Each action was deliberate, each movement measured, berate. As the days passed, the tension grew heavier. Ahioka could sense the watchful eyes of strangers on her land, and the wind seemed to carry more than whispers. It carried warnings. Peace. Yet in this time of uncertainty she found moments of calm. She would sit with Kaya in the evening, listening to the plains and reminding herself of her ancestors' strength. She remembered the buffalo herds, the long journeys, and the courage of the women in her family. Each story, each memory strengthened her resolve. One evening a messenger arrived from town with a formal notice. Ahioka was summoned to appear before the local court to answer charges of trespassing. The letter was polite in tone but heavy with threat. The legal system was not designed to favor someone like her, a solitary woman defending her heritage against a wealthy landowner. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, but she did not falter. She understood that ignoring the summons would bring worse consequences. She had to face this challenge, and she had to find a way to protect herself and her land. Yoka spent that night planning. She reviewed every detail she knew about her property, every interaction she had had with neighbors, and every act of support from the few people willing to help her. Breaths. She considered what she could say, what evidence she could present, and how she could defend herself without provoking further hostility. It was overwhelming, but she drew strength from the quiet courage she had learned over years of solitary living. The following days were tense and filled with preparation. Ahioka trained her mind as carefully as her body, practicing the calm, measured responses she would need in court. She walked her land daily, making sure nothing could be misinterpreted as trespassing.
She spoke with the kind merchant and the teacher who had offered help, gathering advice and quiet reassurance.
And through it all, she felt the presence of Samuel Whitaker's silent support. Small bundles, notes of encouragement, and the knowledge that someone respected her and her life. As the day of the court hearing approached, Ahioka realized that this was more than just a legal challenge. It was a test of survival, courage, and dignity. The plains had taught her many lessons, but this was a lesson of human conflict, prejudice, and justice. She understood that her life, her heritage, and her freedom were all at stake. And though fear lingered, it was tempered by determination. She had faced storms, harsh winters, and isolation. She had endured the loss of her people's lands and traditions, and yet she had survived. Now, she would face the human threat before her with the same quiet strength. The night before she was to appear in court, Ahioka sat outside her cabin, watching the stars. Kaya lay at her feet, calm and alert. She thought of the long history of her people, of the women and men who had lived with courage and wisdom. She whispered a prayer to the wind, asking for guidance, clarity, and protection. The plains were quiet, but the silence carried a promise. She was not powerless. She had knowledge, resilience, and allies, even if they were few.
In the darkness, Ahioka made a vow to herself.
She would not be intimidated. She would defend her home, her freedom, and the memory of her ancestors.
And she would do so with the same dignity and quiet strength that had guided her through every challenge before. Tomorrow, the world outside her grove would see her courage, and she would face it not as a victim, but as a woman who carried the spirit of generations in her heart. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, spilling gold over the plains. Ahioka stood, her eyes steady, her hands calm. Kaya rose beside her, sensing the purpose in her movements. Together, they faced the day that could change everything.
The wind whispered across the grasses, carrying her grandmother's voice and the strength of the ancestors.
Ahioka felt a quiet determination settle in her chest. She would not falter. Whatever awaited in the town, she was ready. The morning of the court hearing arrived, with a gray, chilly sky. The wind swept across the plains, carrying a hint of rain and the faint scent of earth turned wet by the coming storm. Ahioka stood outside her cabin, looking toward the distant town where the trial would take place. Kaya padded quietly beside her, sensing her tension but offering comfort with her calm presence. The world felt heavy that day, and Ahioka knew that what awaited her in town could change her life forever. She gathered her belongings with careful hands. A bundle of simple clothing, a small notebook with notes about her property and land boundaries, and a few supplies she might need. Each item had meaning, each chosen for practicality and necessity. She walked to the edge of her property, looking across the rolling plains one last time before heading toward the unknown challenges of the town. She felt a deep pull in her chest, a mix of fear, courage, and determination. The ride to town was long and quiet. Ahioka had prepared herself for this journey, but she could not ignore the uneasy feeling that grew with each passing mile. Her eyes scanned the horizon constantly, watching for signs of trouble or witnesses. The plains, which had always been her sanctuary, now seemed to stretch endlessly, reflecting the weight of what was to come. As she approached the town, the buildings grew closer together, smoke curling from chimneys, and the streets lined with people going about their daily routines. Ahioka could feel the curious eyes of townspeople turning toward her. Some whispered to one another, pointing subtly in her direction.
Others crossed the street to avoid her gaze.
She kept her head high and walked with calm, measured steps, determined not to let fear or anger control her movements. When she reached the courthouse, she saw a crowd gathered outside. They had come not only to witness the trial, but also to judge her. Their faces were a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and some with open hostility. Ahioka felt her heart tighten, but she reminded herself of the lessons she had learned from her grandmother: patience, courage, and the quiet strength of dignity. She was more than the opinions of strangers, more than the accusations made against her. She had lived her life with honesty, integrity, and respect for the land and people around her. Inside the courthouse, the air was heavy and tense. The room was filled with townspeople, the sheriff, the landowner, and a few others who had come to witness the proceedings. Ahioka stood firmly, her notes clutched in her hands, ready to present her case. She spoke calmly and clearly when called upon, explaining the boundaries of her property, the history of her family's presence on the land, and the false nature of the accusations. Her words were simple but powerful, grounded in truth and the evidence she had gathered. The landowner's representatives tried to speak over her, using legal jargon and threats to intimidate her. They argued that she had no right to remain on the land, that her presence caused disturbances, and that she must be removed immediately. Some townspeople murmured agreement, their voices fueled by misunderstanding or prejudice. Ahioka felt a pang of frustration, but she did not raise her voice or lose her composure. She knew that anger would only weaken her position. Instead, she continued calmly, presenting facts, recounting events, and appealing to reason. Outside the courthouse, Samuel Whitaker watched silently. He had ridden quietly into town that morning, keeping to the shadows and observing from a distance. His presence alone brought a sense of reassurance to Ahioka, though she did not see him yet. Samuel had always acted without seeking recognition, helping where he could, and this day was no different. He waited for the right moment to act, knowing that his support could tip the balance in Ahioka's favor without drawing unnecessary attention. Inside, tensions rose as the trial continued. The sheriff questioned Ahioka sharply, trying to find inconsistencies in her story, hoping to use confusion against her. But she remained steady, answering each question with clarity and honesty. Her voice, soft yet firm, carried through the room. People could see that she spoke from experience and truth, not fear or deception. The landowner, growing impatient, attempted to call witnesses who would testify against Ahioka. Some were reluctant, unsure of how to present their statements without appearing dishonest. Others tried to exaggerate, claiming to have seen her on the land illegally, but their testimony was weak and contradictory. Ahioka listened carefully, noting each statement, each claim, and each error. Her preparation and attention to detail gave her confidence, even as the room grew more hostile. After hours of questioning and testimony, the judge called for a short recess. Ahioka stepped outside into the cool air, her heart pounding from the strain of the trial. She looked around and saw Samuel, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. It was enough. The silent rancher had been watching, prepared to intervene if necessary, and his quiet support reminded Ahioka that she was not entirely alone. Even in the face of overwhelming opposition, there were those who recognized her courage and the truth of her situation.
During the recess, she reflected on her life and the challenges that had brought her to this moment.
She thought of her ancestors, of the women and men who had lived on these plains before her, and of the strength that had been passed down through generations.
Each challenge she faced was not hers alone. It was part of a larger story, a story of survival, heritage, and resilience.
Grasp. She drew strength from this knowledge, letting it steady her nerves and focus her mind. When the trial resumed, Ahioka felt a renewed sense of determination. She continued to present her case, addressing each claim with care and precision. She spoke of the land she had tended, the animals she had cared for, and the boundaries that had always been respected.
She explained how the landowner's accusations were not only false but also unfair, attempting to take what rightfully belonged to her family for generations. As the day wore on, murmurs in the courtroom began to change. Some townspeople who had been suspicious now looked at Ahioka with new respect. Her calmness, honesty, and knowledge of the land could not be ignored. Even those who had doubted her began to see that she was not the troublemaker the landowner had painted her to be. She was a woman who had lived her life with dignity, respecting both the land and the people around her. The landowner, frustrated by the lack of support for his claims, grew angry and attempted one final effort to sway the court. But before he could speak, Samuel stepped forward quietly, presenting evidence he had gathered. He spoke without arrogance or hostility, showing maps, records, and eyewitness accounts that confirmed Ahioka's version of events. His calm presence and careful preparation strengthened her case, and the room grew noticeably more attentive. Ahioka felt a sense of relief and gratitude as Samuel's testimony reinforced her own. Together, their quiet courage and preparation were beginning to turn the tide. She realized that even in a world that seemed hostile and unfair, there were allies to be found, and sometimes the most powerful support came not from loud voices, but from those who acted with quiet determination. By late afternoon, the trial began to reach its conclusion. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, listening to both sides with patience. Ahioka's heart raced as she waited for the decision, but she remained calm outwardly, trusting in the preparation and truth that had guided her through the day. She knew that the outcome could change everything, yet she also understood that she had faced this challenge with honesty and courage, and that in itself was a victory. Finally, the judge spoke. The courtroom fell silent as he reviewed the evidence and statements. He acknowledged that Ahioka had lived on the land for generations, that the landowner's claims were unsupported, and that her presence was lawful. The judge ruled in her favor, confirming her right to remain on her property. Relief washed over her like a wave, and she felt tears prick her eyes. She had faced a formidable challenge, one that could have stripped her of her home and freedom, yet she had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, the wind carried a sense of calm and renewal. Ahioka looked across the town square and saw Samuel waiting. Their eyes met, and she gave a small nod of thanks.
He returned it with a quiet smile, understanding the depth of the moment without words. Together, they had faced the challenge, and together they had survived it with dignity and courage. As she walked back to her cabin, Ahioka felt the weight of the day begin to lift. The plains stretched before her, unchanged in their vast beauty, but somehow different now. She had faced human hostility, prejudice, and threat, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined. Her connection to the land, to her heritage, and to the quiet allies who had supported her had been reaffirmed. That night, as she sat outside her cabin with Kaya by her side, Ahioka reflected on the events of the day. She thought of the courage required not just to survive, but to stand for what was right. She understood that freedom and dignity were not always easily won, and that the strength of the spirit could sometimes be the most powerful force of all. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks honoring her ancestors, the land, and the allies who had helped her. The stars shone brightly over the plains, their light reflecting in her eyes. Ahioka knew that challenges would come again. Life on the frontier was never without its trials, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She had learned that courage, preparation, and quiet determination could overcome even the harshest obstacles. And with that knowledge, she felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she could continue to live, honor her heritage, and protect her home. The days after the court hearing were quieter, but the tension in Ahioka's life had not entirely vanished. While she had won the legal battle and secured her right to live on her land, the landowner and his supporters were not entirely satisfied. Rumors spread through the town that they were plotting to intimidate her further, to make life uncomfortable enough that she might leave on her own. Ahioka knew that victory in the courtroom did not always guarantee safety in the real world. She had faced one challenge, but the real test of courage, resilience, and survival was only beginning. Each morning, Ahioka moved with care, observing her surroundings more closely than ever. She checked fences, inspected her animals, and ensured that her garden and cabin were secure. Kaya, her loyal companion, seemed to sense the unease in the air and stayed close at all times, watching the edges of the property with alert eyes. Though she tried to maintain her routine, there was a constant awareness that she was still vulnerable to the threats of human cruelty. One morning, as the sun barely touched the horizon, a group of men appeared at the far edge of her property. They were mounted on horses and moved with deliberate confidence. Ahioka froze for a moment, her heart tightening. The men were clearly here for her, and their intent was not friendly. She could see the landowner among them, his expression cold and determined. This was the moment she had feared. The challenge that went beyond legal papers, beyond words in a courtroom. This was the moment where courage alone would have to carry her through. Ahioka stayed calm outwardly, though her mind raced. She knew that confrontation could be dangerous, but retreating would mean giving up everything she had fought to protect her. She thought of her ancestors, of the women and men who had endured far greater hardships, and drew strength from their resilience. She quietly signaled to Kaya to stay close, and began moving toward the group in measured steps. Her voice was calm, steady, and strong when she spoke.
"What is the meaning of this?" she asked, her eyes meeting the landowner's without flinching.
"I've done nothing to deserve this," the landowner sneered, trying to intimidate her with his size, the number of men with him, and his loud, commanding voice. He claimed she was trespassing, that her animals were interfering with his property, and that she had no right to remain. The words were loud, meant to frighten, but Ahioka's calm presence diffused some of their power. She did not shout or argue in haste. Instead, she relied on her preparation, knowledge of the land, and quiet courage. At that moment, a shadow moved at the edge of the trees. It was Samuel Whitaker, the silent rancher who had helped her before. He rode toward the group with a calm but purposeful stride. Unlike the landowner and his men, he did not raise his voice or act aggressively. He simply presented himself as a witness, someone who could attest to the boundaries of Ahioka's property and the truth of her living there for generations. The landowner's men hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Samuel's calm demeanor and clear evidence began to shift the balance. He had maps, notes, and first-hand observations that confirmed Ahioka's claims. His presence reminded everyone that she was not alone, that the law and truth were on her side, and that intimidation would not easily succeed. The confrontation grew tense as the two sides faced each other. The landowner's anger increased, but he realized that direct aggression could backfire. Some of his men started to murmur among themselves, unsure whether to follow his commands or trust the evidence Samuel provided. Ahioka watched carefully, understanding that this moment required patience, clarity, and careful judgment. One wrong move could escalate into violence, which she desperately wanted to avoid. Ahioka spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "I respect the law.
I respect the land. I have done nothing to harm anyone.
My family has lived here for generations. I will not be intimidated, and I ask that you leave peacefully." Her words had a surprising effect. Some of the men lowered their heads, uncertain, while others looked at Samuel for guidance. The landowner, frustrated by the lack of support and realizing that force would not succeed, paused. Samuel's quiet authority and the truth of the situation were stronger than any threats.
It was a moment where courage, preparation, and truth proved more powerful than intimidation or anger. After a long silence, the landowner finally gave a sharp gesture.
He ordered his men to return to town. The group slowly mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Ahioka and Samuel standing on the plains. Deep sense of relief washed over her. She had faced the most immediate threat to her freedom and survived not through aggression, but through calm courage, truth, and the support of an ally who had never sought recognition.
Once the danger had passed, Ahioka and Samuel walked back to her cabin together. Words were few, but the silence carried understanding.
Samuel did not speak of heroics. He simply reminded her through his presence that she had the right to live with dignity and safety. Kaya ran ahead, barking softly, sensing the lighter mood. Ahioka felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and renewed determination. She realized that this moment had tested not only her courage, but also her ability to rely on others when necessary. That evening, Ahioka sat outside her cabin, the fire glowing warmly in the hearth. She reflected on the day's events, the fear, the tension, and the ultimate triumph. She understood that life on the plains required vigilance, wisdom, and patience. Danger could appear without warning, and strength alone was not always enough. But courage, truth, and allies could overcome even the most daunting challenges. As the stars emerged in the night sky, Ahioka whispered a prayer of gratitude. Uris. She honored her ancestors who had survived far worse trials, and thanked the quiet hero who had helped her when she needed it most. The plains stretched endlessly before her, vast and beautiful, carrying the promise of continued life, freedom, and the preservation of her heritage. In the days that followed, Ahioka strengthened her routines, tending to her land and her animals with renewed vigor. She knew that threats could return, but she also knew that she had faced the most immediate danger with courage and wisdom. Her confidence grew not from pride, but from the knowledge that she had defended her home and her freedom without compromising her principles. Neighbors and townspeople began to view her differently as well. Word of her courage and the peaceful resolution of the confrontation spread slowly through the town. Some who had been skeptical or hostile now approached with respect, recognizing that Ahioka was not someone to be intimidated or dismissed. Her presence, once considered a threat, was now a testament to resilience, dignity, and the strength of truth. Ahioka also deepened her connection to Samuel, though words between them were few. There was a shared understanding and mutual respect. He had acted quietly, without seeking recognition, but his support had been essential in securing her freedom and safety. Ahioka recognized that allies could come in unexpected forms, and that quiet strength often spoke louder than anger or bravado, burst. The experience changed her. She had always lived with caution and awareness, but now she understood more fully the importance of courage, planning, and collaboration. She reflected on the lessons she had learned, that fear could be managed, that truth held power, and that freedom was something worth defending with wisdom as much as with bravery.
Even in moments of calm, Ahioka remained vigilant.
She continued her routines, observing the plains, checking fences, and caring for her animals, but she no longer felt the weight of uncertainty pressing constantly on her. But she had faced a decisive challenge, and she had emerged stronger. Her connection to the land, to her heritage, and to those who supported her was deeper than ever. As the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Ahioka felt a profound sense of peace. She had defended her home, preserved her freedom, and honored the legacy of her ancestors. The world around her would continue to change, but she was prepared to meet whatever came next with courage, dignity, and wisdom. That night, as she sat by the fire with Kaya curled at her feet, Ahioka allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought of the trials she had faced, the fear she had endured, and the quiet strength that had carried her through. She whispered a final prayer of gratitude to the spirits of her ancestors and to the plains that had shaped her life. The fire crackled softly, the stars twinkled above, and a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced the storm and emerged victorious. Ahioka understood that life on the frontier would always bring challenges, but she now carried proof of her own resilience. She had learned that courage, preparation, and truth could overcome even the most threatening adversities. And though the future was unknown, she was ready, confident in her ability to protect her home, preserve her heritage, and continue the legacy of her people with unwavering strength. The morning sun rose slowly over the plains, bathing the land in a soft golden light. Ahioka stood outside her cabin, breathing in the cool, fresh air. The wind swept through the tall grasses, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and the promise of a new day. For the first time in many weeks, the tension that had gripped her heart felt lighter. The court's decision and the confrontation with the landowner were behind her, and she could finally begin to breathe freely, knowing her home and heritage were secure. Ahioka moved about her daily routine, with a calm confidence that came from the deep knowledge that she had survived the greatest trials of her life.
She fed her chickens, checked on her horses, and tended to her garden, each task performed with steady hands and a clear mind.
There was a quiet joy in these simple activities, a reassurance that the land she loved would continue to provide for her, as it always had. Each plant, each animal, and each corner of her cabin reminded her of the generations who had come before and the resilience that ran through her family's blood. Despite the calm, Ahioka did not forget the lessons she had learned in recent weeks. She knew that living in the world required vigilance and awareness. Even when victory had been achieved, threats could return, people could misunderstand, and prejudice could arise. Yet she also understood that courage, preparation, and honesty were her strongest defenses. She had relied on them before and would continue to do so. The plains had taught her that life was a balance of patience, action, and trust. In the wisdom of those who had gone before, Samuel Whitaker continued to be a quiet presence in her life. He did not seek recognition or friendship for its own sake, but his support had become a source of comfort and reassurance. Sometimes he would arrive with supplies or a small gift, left carefully where Ahioka could find it without attracting attention. Other times he would simply observe from a distance, ensuring her safety without interfering unnecessarily. Their relationship was one of mutual respect and understanding, built on actions rather than words. Ahioka had come to trust him deeply, recognizing that true allies often worked quietly, without seeking praise or reward. Life on the plains began to settle into a new rhythm.
Ahioka spent her days maintaining her land, caring for her animals, and ensuring her property remained secure.
She also began to focus on preserving the traditions and stories of her people. She practiced the dances, songs, and rituals she had learned from her grandmother, keeping them alive in her own way. These moments were sacred, a way to honor the past while embracing the present. They reminded her that she was not only a survivor, but also a keeper of her culture and history. The townspeople, too, began to see Ahioka in a new light. Some who had been suspicious or hostile now approached her with cautious respect. They had witnessed her courage, her dignity, and her ability to defend herself without resorting to anger or violence. Slowly, barriers began to break down, and a few neighbors offered friendship, trade, or simple gestures of goodwill. Ahioka welcomed these connections carefully, understanding that trust must be earned, but also appreciating the sense of community that was slowly returning. Ahioka also began to reflect on the deeper meaning of her experiences. She realized that freedom was not simply the absence of threat. It was the ability to live according to one's principles, to honor one's heritage, and to act with integrity even in the face of danger. Her struggles had tested every part of her being, her courage, her patience, her wisdom, and she had emerged stronger, more grounded, and more aware of the values that truly mattered. The plains, which had once seemed vast and empty, now felt alive with possibility and purpose. In the quiet moments of the evening, Ahioka would sit outside her cabin, Kaya at her side, watching the stars appear one by one. She thought of her grandmother, of the ancestors who had walked these lands long before her, and of the stories they had passed down. Prayers of thanks not only for the victories she had achieved, but also for the lessons she had learned. Life had tested her, but it had also taught her the power of courage, truth, and quiet strength. Sometimes she would visit the town, moving carefully through the streets with her head held high. The townspeople greeted her with polite nods, and some even smiled. She would stop at the small store to exchange goods or offer her knowledge of the land to those who sought it. Ahioka's presence was no longer a source of suspicion or fear. It was a reminder that strength and dignity could endure even in the most challenging circumstances. People began to recognize her not only as the last Comanche woman in the area, but as a symbol of resilience, courage, and wisdom. Ahioka's connection to Samuel deepened over time. They rarely spoke at length, but their understanding of each other grew with shared experiences and quiet actions. He remained a steadfast ally, offering help when needed, but never imposing or overstepping. Through his support, Ahioka learned the value of trust and the importance of having someone who could act with integrity without demanding recognition. Together they demonstrated that courage and wisdom often thrived in silence, guided by principle rather than ego. As the seasons changed, Ahioka's life continued, with a sense of balance and purpose. Spring turned to summer, summer to autumn, and the plains transformed with each passing month. She harvested her crops, cared for her animals, and prepared her land for the coming winter. Each day was filled with work, reflection, and the quiet satisfaction of living in harmony with her surroundings. The challenges she had faced became stories of strength, guiding her actions and decisions. She also made a point to pass on her knowledge. Narration. Though she had no family nearby, Ahioka taught children and young adults in the town about the land, about the plants and animals, and about the history of her people. She shared stories of courage, resilience, and respect for nature.
These lessons became a bridge between the past and the present, ensuring that her heritage would not be forgotten. The children listened with wide eyes, and even some adults began to appreciate the wisdom she offered.
Ahioka found joy in small moments. A flower blooming in her garden, the soft nuzzle of Kaya, the gentle rustle of the wind through the grasses. Each moment was a reminder of the beauty and resilience of life. She learned that freedom was not just about survival. It was about cherishing the present, honoring the past, and embracing the possibility of the future. The plains, once a place of solitude and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary of growth, strength, and reflection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Ahioka reflected on her journey. She thought of the fear she had felt when facing the court, the confrontation with the landowner, and the constant tension of living alone on the frontier. She realized that those experiences had shaped her, strengthened her, and revealed the depth of her own courage. She had faced injustice, intimidation, and prejudice, yet she had emerged with dignity intact and her freedom preserved. Verse. Ahioka whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to the spirits of her ancestors, and to the land itself. She acknowledged the lessons she had learned, the allies who had supported her, and the resilience that had carried her through. Breath. The plains stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of both the challenges and the possibilities of life. She felt a sense of completion, knowing that she had not only survived but had done so with wisdom, grace, and unwavering strength. Her story became one that would be remembered, not only by those who had witnessed it but also by the land itself. The plains, the trees, the rivers, and the skies carried the memory of her courage and perseverance. Ahioka knew that her life was a continuation of her people's legacy, a testament to the strength of women, and a reflection of the enduring connection between humans and the land they call home. As night fell, Ahioka sat outside her cabin, Kaya resting at her feet. The fire burned softly, illuminating her calm, thoughtful face. She gazed up at the stars, feeling a profound sense of peace. She had faced trials that could have broken her, yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Her home was safe, her heritage preserved, and her freedom secured. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had led her to a deeper understanding of courage, resilience, and the power of quiet strength. Ahioka understood that life would continue to bring challenges, as it always did, but she also knew that she possessed the inner strength to face them, the wisdom to navigate them, and the courage to endure them. She was no longer simply surviving, she was thriving, living in harmony with the land, honoring her ancestors, and leaving a legacy that would inspire those who came after her. The plains were alive with sound and movement, the rustle of grasses, the distant call of birds, and the soft murmur of the wind. Ahioka felt herself deeply connected to this world, to the people she had helped and who had helped her, and to the generations of her people who had walked this land before her. She understood that her story was part of something larger, a story of endurance, wisdom, and quiet heroism.
In the stillness of the night, Ahioka whispered one final prayer of gratitude.
She thanked the land for its guidance, the spirits of her ancestors for their protection, and the allies who had walked alongside her. She embraced the peace she had earned through courage, patience, and integrity. The plains stretched endlessly around her, a living testament to survival, freedom, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And in that moment, Ahioka knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, free, strong, and at peace, carrying the legacy of her people forward with pride and dignity.